Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update, a weekly program devoted to the economic dimensions of our lives. Income, jobs, debts, burdens for ourselves, for our children, issues, events, trends. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I've been a professor of economics all my adult life, and I hope that has trained me to be a useful interpreter and presenter of the economic changes swirling around us. Today's program is a little different from the usual because it's an overview. We're trying to take stock of an economy as we move out of one year, 2017, and now into a new one, 2018. It's important for us to talk about the major events and the major trends that are part of last year's history and part of what's unfolding now, to get a better sense of where we've been and where we're going. So I've picked several of the key events and trends to bring to your attention, to give you a sense as well of how the economy is shifting. One of the big things that happened at the end of 2017 was a decision by the Federal Communications Commission to end net neutrality, that is, to change the rules that have been governing access to the internet for all of us, and likewise access to the internet by all the people and institutions that provide the content, which is why we go to the internet to get that content. Several big companies control that access. Probably the most important and biggest one is Verizon. And Verizon plays a big role here because the person who's the head of the Federal Communications Commission, Ajit Pai, used to be a lawyer for Verizon. So now he's in the position of deciding what to give to his former employer, and if he's like others, maybe his future employer too. We'll never know until that day happens. Here's the issue. The rules up until now, and these are the rules that allowed things like Google and Netflix and so on to become the giants that they are today, to give the United States economy a kind of technological edge that we have been losing in many other industries. They've all benefited from the rules as they've been, which are everybody has access in the same way, and everybody who produces content has access in the same way. That is, we are neutral. We do not discriminate, or to be more accurate, we don't allow the access controllers, like Verizon, to control how we communicate and how we interact on the internet. Under the new rules, these companies will be able to do that. They'll be able to let some content through and others not. They'll be able to allow us to get some content quickly and some content less quickly. Why would they be interested in doing that? Well, you know the answer before I tell you, because it will allow companies like Verizon to charge money for the faster communication, for example, to charge fees for access to certain kinds of content that they couldn't do under the old rules. So this big struggle that took the entirety of 2017, actually began earlier than that, was about one group of companies, like Verizon, wanting to change the rules because they make more profits that way, and other companies, for example, content providers like Netflix, Google, Facebook, and so on, they were scared when this conversation began that they would have to pay fees, they would lose profits. So like so many of these big issues, it turns out they're between one group of companies and another. Companies that stand to get more profits by a change, and companies that stand to lose, and they're fighting it out to get the government to decide. And as they fight, it's useful for them to get the public on their sides. So one side tells us all kinds of good things will happen to the public if only we do what they want, and the other side gives us the counter-argument. Wonderful things will happen to us if we do what they want, and we're supposed to choose between them. Well, here's my advice as an economist. Neither of the two groups that are fighting, those who want to keep the rules and those who want to change them are interested in us. They are all profit-making capitalist companies, and big ones to boot. They are looking out for their bottom line. And what is likely to happen is that Verizon will get to charge money, but won't dare charge it to the major content producers because they're too big and might find a way around them. So they'll work out a compromise that protects their profits. And who will be having to pay a bit more here and there for internet access? Yeah, you and me. Because this is an institution we all now need, and they get that, and they're going to make us pay. What's the alternative? Deal with the internet for what it is. And by the way, there are countries around the world already doing that. Finland, I recently read about, for example, absolutely considers the internet a public utility. Like the land, like the forests, like electricity, and so on. It is not going to allow that to be used as a football between competing profiteers. It is a public utility, and the public's interest comes first. That would be the way to deal with this. Make the rules serve the majority of the people. What an idea, rather than small groups of profiteers, the shareholders and executives of one group of companies fighting another. Another enormous issue of enormous historical importance has been a struggle in the workplace. And this one has been led mostly by women, some men involved too, but mostly women, who have brought out of the shadows a fundamental issue of the workplace for all of us. And what is that issue? Well, the way it was brought up, particularly in 2017, was an explosion around sexual harassment and sexual assaults in the workplace. Names like Susan Fowler at the Uber Corporation, Rose McGowan, a leader in the critique of Harvey Feinstein and the film industry, and perhaps most important, Tarana Burke, who started the Me Too movement, which has transformed so much of America in such a short time. What's this all about? Well, it goes far beyond the immediate question in which men imposed sexual demands on women and even on some men as well. By using what? By using the particular way we organize business in this country, how we organize factories, offices, and stores. And what do I mean? I mean that we have a tiny group of people, the top executives, the board of directors, literally 10, 20, 30, 40 people, have enormous power. They can give you a job or take it away from you, give you an income or take it away from you, allow you to move up in the hierarchy of the company or keep you down, give you an opportunity of a lifetime or block you from it. Tiny group of people with enormous power over the livelihoods, the jobs, the career futures, the opportunities of a large number. Does that sound democratic? No, it doesn't, does it? And guess what? Which should come as no surprise. If you give that kind of unequal power to a few, you're literally creating the opportunity for them who have that power to abuse it, to make demands on people below them to meet their needs, sexual but not sexual too, or else risk losing a job, or else risk losing promotion, or else risk losing the opportunity. The fundamental issue brought by the women in particular who have said this has got to stop goes far beyond the immediate demand, stop sexual harassment on the job. Important as it is, crucial as it has been, because what these women are doing is calling out the hierarchical structure of the workplace for everybody. Why do we allow a small group of people to have that kind of power over a large group with no return power? That should have been the problem all along. And particularly in a country that fashions itself democratic, If democracy is a valuable thing, then it belongs in the workplace, from which it has been excluded from the earliest days of our society. We're not a democratic society if we mean to include the workplace, which is a remarkable kind of thing to say in a country that calls itself democratic and where most people spend most of their adult lives at work, in the workplace. The women are teaching us that there is an inequality that has horrific personal consequences. And you know, while the suffering you go through if you are sexually harassed or assaulted is unquestionable, there's lots of other kinds of suffering that are very similar. A career denied, a career broken, a job lost, a family dislocated because someone with power has the ability to do that to you. And the solution comes immediately. If we had worker cooperatives as the basic way we organized jobs, if when you went to work, you went into a community run democratically, where everybody who is an employee is also an employer, where the people who work are their own bosses, working to divide the labor amongst themselves, everyone holding everyone else accountable. You're not then going to have a few people in a position to extort things out of other people. You don't even have the employer-employee dichotomy. Nobody's in a position to abuse another as a worker because everybody who's a worker is also an employer, and everybody who's an employer is also a worker. Hiring and firing is a collective decision, not one that is concentrated in a few people. You know, in the human race, if you go back and you read about kings and emperors and czars, people who had power in a whole society, rather like the power that a board of directors has at a workplace, you will remember that you read about things like concubines and harems and all the ways that those kinds of people, kings and emperors, abused, including in sexual ways, their authority. We got rid of kings. And part of the reason was we didn't want that kind of authority. No government that isn't accountable. Well, if it's going to be a government that has to be accountable to the people, what about the government inside the workplace? Why isn't it accountable? Why haven't we set up the institution, the democratic working out of the big decisions, so that nobody is in a position to abuse? Last point on this, that this struggle by women across America has brought home. This is not a problem that's going to be solved by telling people not to misbehave. Let me remind everyone that a few decades ago, when we had a big drug problem in this country, we had leaders saying that the important thing to do is to turn to the people abusing drugs and say to them, just say no. Well, we've tried that. 30, 40 years. Our drug problem today is worse than it was then. Telling people to just say no doesn't work. Telling people not to sexually harass or abuse others, not going to work either. You have to change the way people are connected, how they relate to one another, to stop this from happening. And going away from a hierarchical, top-down, undemocratic workplace to a collective community workplace where everybody's accountable to everybody else is a way to reorganize society so neither sexual nor other kinds of abuse are driven by a system that reproduces that kind of behavior, as these women in 2017 have taught us so well. The next bizarre event of 2017 can be called the Bitcoin explosion. What was that about? Well, let's talk first about the reasonable side of it. As you all know, money is something that is basically produced by governments and also produced by banks in the normal way that banks do business. But the banks set up their money by creating checking accounts and so on, using the government-issued cash. In this country, the dollar bill, the $20 bill, the $100 bill, and so on. It has always, therefore, been a fantasy of all kinds of people. Why can't we have other kinds of money, multiple sources of money? And you know, in the United States, as in most other countries, we did that for a while. The early years of the United States as an independent country had money coming from all sides. Different states had money. Sometimes different counties within states issued their own currency. If you were doing business and moving, say, from Maine in the north to Maryland or Virginia in the south, you as a business person would traverse regions with different money, and you'd have to exchange the money from Maine for the money from Massachusetts, and then that money with the money from New Jersey, and that money with the money from Delaware, and so on. And then we unified all that into one money, and that always left the question, gee, how would it be if we had multiple sources of money again? And you know how unkindly the law looks upon people who take it into their own hands to do that, by counterfeiting money, for example. So it's always been a fantasy, and there's an interesting question about what would be the economic consequences of different people issuing money if it wasn't only the government. Bitcoin begins by saying, here's another kind of money, and let's see if we can get people to accept it. In exchange for work they do or goods that they sell, will they take another currency, an electronic currency, Bitcoin, as a substitute for dollar bills or euros? And if they take them, will they be able to spend them on other things so that it works like money? And that's an interesting question, and that began to be asked by these people who make cryptocurrencies, alternative currencies, or what you call them, and the biggest of them has been Bitcoin. That's the reasonable side. Now we come to the unreasonable side. Every commodity that has ever existed, every good that goes through a market from buyer to seller and so on, has become at one point or another an object of speculation. What do I mean? It begins to be purchased not for whatever use it originally had, but for a very different purpose. It is bought in order to be resold at a higher price. Let me give you an example. Perhaps the most famous example were tulips grown in Holland back in the early 18th century. Now, tulips had a purpose. They were a flower, they were grown by gardeners, and because of their beauty, they would be purchased by people to beautify their gardens, etc. Useful things. But then, somebody got the idea, whoa, if I buy these tulips in the right way, in the right color, at the right time, and I wait, I could sell them maybe for more money. And that person did it, and everybody noticed, wow, he bought them for 10 and sold them for 20. Maybe if I buy them for 20, I'll be able to sell them for 30. And they did, and that brought more people in. And they convinced folks, look, don't buy these tulips because they make your garden beautiful. Buy these tulips because you're going to get rich quickly. And you know how and why? Simply because if you buy it, it's going up and you'll be able to make money by selling at a higher price. And how will you be able to do that? By convincing the person you sell it at a higher price to that he or she can do the same. And it's just an upward and onward spiral. That's what happened to Bitcoin. It went from something worth a few hundred US dollars to something on the order of 20,000 or more by the end of 2017. And a lot of people made a lot of money buying and reselling at a higher price. That's a speculation. It happened to tulips, it's happened to gold frequently, it's happened to almost everything. All you need is to get enough people to believe that they can resell at a higher price, and then it gets going and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You suck in more and more people, the more they observe how much money you could make by simply buying something, sitting on it for a matter of weeks or months, and selling it. No work, no production, no value added, pure speculation. The Bitcoin phenomena is that. And like every other speculation of its kind, it ends badly. We look back on what happened to the tulips and refer to it as tulip mania. Finally, as the price went higher and higher for tulips, it got to a point where the risk was too high. The amount of money you would have to spend to buy tulips was so enormous that the risk that it might not go up simply was too frightening. And at that point, nobody stepped in to buy, which meant the last people who had laid out money discovered they weren't going to make more. So they quickly sold it for fear it would go down. And when it goes down, the fear that it's going to go down further makes everyone holding it dump it. And the price goes down as fast or faster than it went up. Everyone thinking of playing with bitcoins has to understand this is just another crazy speculation, which is one of the side effects that can be so disastrous of the institution we call the market, and has to be weighed when we wonder whether there might not be better ways to distribute resources and products than buying and selling them, given the potential at any time for the kinds of crazed speculation Bitcoin has been seen to go through. Before turning to our remaining updates, I wanted to remind you that we have two websites that we ask you to make use of: rdwolf with 2fs.com and democracyatwork.info. These are websites available for you, no charge whatsoever, 24/7. There are ways for you to communicate with us, to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and basically to become a partner of what we're trying to do. Help us reach other people. Make use of what we put up on there. And I want to address particularly those of you who are listeners to our program on the radio, that if you would like to see this as a television program, the best way and the most helpful to us would be to go to patreon.com, Patreon, patreon.com/economic update, and follow us in that way. A trend across 2017 is continuing into 2018, has been going on for 30 years now. And that's the growing inequality in the distribution of income and wealth. There is no end to it. In fact, it looks and feels sort of like a speculation a la Bitcoin. What do I mean? As more and more of the wealth of the world is concentrated in a few people at the top, and this has been going on across the board, North America, Western Europe, China, India, it's unbelievable how it is everywhere. The only thing these countries have basically in common is the world capitalist economic system, of which they are all an enthusiastic part these days. And it's the capitalist system that is producing and sustaining this rising inequality. It is a very serious thing. And the connection between that and Bitcoin is easy to pinpoint. The more you concentrate wealth in the hands of a few, the less the purchasing power of the many. So the few have all this wealth, but they don't invest it in producing goods and services because the mass of people can't afford to buy it. The very inequality destroys itself. And eventually, it blows societies up. We have leadership in the world that has been bought and paid for by the people at the top with the wealth, which is why nothing is being done to undo it, to reverse it, even to stop it. We have the kind of society inequality now that resembles people on a train rushing towards a stone wall. They see it, they know it, but they can't seem to stop it. There's something unspeakably tragic about all that. Having said that, I want to point out that Europe is in a different place. Europe has lost an entire decade. From 2007 to 2017 is a lost 10 years. The European economy collapsed along with the world capitalist system in 27 and 28. And it hasn't recovered until now. And everybody's excited that there's some recovery actually happening in Europe now after 10 years of decline, of lost production, of lost jobs, of destroyed lives. Countries like Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal are living in an economic downturn that they're only beginning to emerge from. And I, of course, welcome that economic conditions are improving in Europe. And it's not only good for Europe, it helps the United States and so forth have less economic suffering. But let's be clear. We are recovering from a system that produced 10 years lost. For people who lived through it, those are not recoverable. For people whose homes were lost, and they number in the tens of millions, they'll never recover from this. The effects of this will last lifetimes. Educations that were destroyed, governments that were destroyed, wealth of a society that was destroyed. Capitalism is a fundamentally unstable system, and we've just come through a 10-year collapse. Even if there is a recovery, what are we doing keeping a system that works like this? Are we waiting for the next calamity, the next 10-year collapse? The time to act is now. We know the system is unstable. We've just lived through it. The last economic update we have time for today has to do with something that struck me. The state of California has had a very serious time, 2017, particularly, with fires. Fires in the north of California and fires in the south. You may not know it, but an army, a small army of thousands of firefighters are needed to control these fires and prevent them from doing more damage than they already did. What you may not know is that somewhere between 7 and 10% of the firefighters in California are prisoners from the prison system of the state of California. I began to look into this when I was told of the difference in what they are paid. If you're a regular firefighter and you're hired, you get paid from $10.50 per hour up to $41.34 an hour for your work, which is arduous and dangerous and so on. If you are a prisoner, you get paid $2 a day plus $1 per hour. Folks, that's slave labor. That's making use of people who are not free and paying them very little. It's only possible because the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which outlawed slavery, made an exception if you are being punished for a crime. And so here's my appeal. 1, what kind of rehabilitation, what kind of help are you giving to a person who has the problem of being convicted of a crime by requiring them, they can volunteer as a prisoner? Be a good idea to do what your warden tells you to volunteer for, wouldn't it? What are you doing by imposing slavery on people? And my second question is, why do the working people who are not in jail permit this? Those people being paid very little are taking the jobs of people who could and should be paid appropriately for such difficult and dangerous and socially important work. This is not an acceptable arrangement for either party, and nor should anyone say, gee, prisoners sometimes really do volunteer. I'm sure they do. And the way that's done is to have the prisons so unpleasant, the work inside so difficult, the rehabilitation so minimal, the punishment and the lonely isolation so awful that it's actually better to go out and fight for a fire than to stay in jail. That's not a celebration of voluntary, that's a denunciation of conditions. We've come to the end of the first half of Economic Update. Please stay with us after a short break. We'll be back for the second half.